Or as I mentioned at the end of the last video, I was getting way too long, so I had to split this video in half. So here it is, rigging swim baits on jig heads. Alright, during the intro video and the descriptive video of the different types of jig heads, we looked at this little jig head here with the insert versus this jig head with the screw lock, and we talked about the differences between the two, one being the offset here. So this is basically built on an offset hook, whereas this hook essentially has zero offset. So the hook point is in line with the line tie, whereas this one, you've got this the hook point is well above the line tie. So both of these have their places. What you'll find with this kind of hook, though, is it's very specific to a certain type of swim bait. You cannot rig this hook on just any kind of swim bait. So we'll talk about where we'll use this one. The problem with this one now is this insert one bridges a lot of the gap in the hook. So if we look here, that kind of covers the gap in the hookup. So we've got to hope that this thing presses out of the way, which means we got to rig this thing such that it's really simple for the swim bait for the hook to push through the swim bait and not clog the gap of the hookup, so we can actually get a decent hookup ratio. The other thing you'll notice about this hook is the shank on this particular one is incredibly short. So between the nose of the bait and where the hook pocket is in the bait, we don't have a whole lot of room. So what that leads us to is we end up with these little tiny swim baits. And we'll see that if we look at here, where this thing lines up, it basically falls right in the middle of that hook pocket. So let's look at how we'd rig this thing up on this little tiny swim bait here. So good news is it's fairly easy to rig up. Grab our little insert here, line everything up, and we're just going to push this straight into the nose of the bait. Push it all the way through until this last flange in the keeper is inside the bait. Otherwise it'll just pull right off, it'll just pop right off. Alright, so that's on there fairly solid. We're going to look at where this is going to come through. Fold the bait up right into the bottom pocket, and we're going to come right out through the top pocket here. And we want this thing to lie as flat as possible. So we'll stretch it out a little bit and go ahead and text pose this. So now we've got this nice and straight, and this should swim fairly well. So it's kind of a finesse swim bait. It's very small. This is a 1/4 ounce weight, I believe. So, alright, so the next challenge we've got to deal with is this type of bait with this offset, this big offset on the hook. So where this really lends itself in is I've got a bait that has a rigging point down here low. The top of the bait's up fairly high, so see that this lays in here quite nicely. So if I screw this screw lock into the flat point of this nose, the hook is going to lay right in this groove here. Now where I'm going to run into trouble is there's not a whole lot of there's a whole lot of meat to this bait down here, and there's not a lot of clearance on this hook. It doesn't have a big, real deep belly on it. So what'll happen is when I go to set the hook, I'm only really going to get about that much of the hook sticking out the top, which might be enough, but I want to increase my odds a little bit. So what we're going to do is we're going to open the belly of this bait up. We're going to make a hook slit in the belly of this bait to give this hook somewhere to go when we set the hook. So as I mentioned previously, we'll take our knife. If we need to do this, we're going to figure out where this thing needs to be, and we're only going to cut away as much plastic as through as much plastic as we really need to get this thing to hook up. We don't want to go too deep, but we don't want to go too shallow either. So we need to leave some plastic at the top, so we don't want to go all the way through the bait. And we need to leave some plastic at the nose for the screw lock to go into. Just slowly work our way through the bait, getting farther and farther down in there. And just kind of open the belly of this bait up a little bit. Alright, so you can see we got a decent hook pocket in here now, or hook slit. So we can go ahead and rig this thing up. So this bait's kind of big, it's going to be a little bit difficult to rig. Just want to screw this down in here as best we can. Alright, so we got the bait up nice and tight on the nose there. We need to fold the bait up and come out the top. Straighten everything out. Go ahead and text pose this thing. So because we added this hook slit, when we set the hook, what will happen now is this bait will drop all the way down there. Now we got a nice big, a relatively big bite for the hook to take. Drop that back down in there, and it's fairly unobtrusive. Got a decent weight to it, and this should swim fairly well. Alright, so our next couple options are our various jig heads. Alright, so ball head jig. Where does this really excel? So let's take something like our little skinny dipper type bait. Alright, yes, it's got a hook slit. It does work really well on the small gap screw lock hooks, but these are also perfect for a ball jig head. So it's got a nice pointed nose to it. There's no back to the head here that I really need to hide a hook in, that I need to mate up to a squared front on the bait. So this is just nice and simple. Just going to thread this on, get it around the bend. The key here is keeping these things straight. So this hook's got a fairly long shank on it, so keeping it all rigged straight can be a bit of a challenge. And as a result, you may have to try and re-rig, and try and re-rig, end up re-rigging this thing like 4 times to get it to sit on the hook straight. We're going to run it in there. We're going to push it over the barb. I went a little bit too far, but I can feed this on here a little bit if I need to. And not optimal. So, like I said, as I was saying, try a couple times to rig this thing straight. Gentle, bring it back over the keeper. Bring this out a little bit. Back out of the bait, right in that slit. Slit's a nice aiming tool to keep this thing rigged straight. And there we go, just a basic swim bait rigged on a ball head. And this is open water when I'm not worried about it being weedless. And ideally, I'd want that to be perfectly straight as well. So notice I got a little bit of a waver in there, and that might affect the way this thing swims. So be real careful and real conscientious about making sure everything's straight on this. Alright, so that brings us to kind of our basic jig head here with a square back on it. So this pair up really well with our Kitech style baits. They got a little bit of a square front on them, and if I really want to be, anal about this, I can take my knife and take the very front off this bait. To give myself a nice flat front to rig to now. So just like the last one, I want to be very careful that I run this on straight. And as the bait comes around the shank of the hook, or around the bend of the hook, it can be a little challenging to keep the thing straight. Run it out and up the jig head. Push it on the keeper really well. And I've just got a nice straightly rigged bait. So once again, the key to all these jig heads, you'll notice, is keeping things straight. Alright, so the last one, that one had a small back to it. This jig here's got a bigger square back to it, so how do I handle that? The other thing you'll notice about this jig is it's got a fairly slim profile to it, so ideally I want to marry this up to something shaped the same. So I'm going to grab one here that I've already got rigged.
So this is that same swim bait, but instead of being a 3/8 ounce, this is actually a 1 ounce version. And it's married up with just a straight paddle tail swim bait trailer tail. So like the MC swim baits we were looking at earlier, this is another MC swim bait, as a matter of fact. But so this type bait with the squared off front already, we want to mate it up to an appropriately sized jig head. So this is just a big jig and a big bait, but this is mated up fairly nicely. Once again, the important thing to remember is do everything you can to get this thing rigged straight so your hook shank is running right down the spine of the bait, and the bait doesn't end up with a big S curve in it, because it'll affect the way that the bait swims. So for our underspins, we'll rig those essentially the same way, and the same rules apply as far as marrying them up to something. This little underspin, I'm going to go ahead and mate it up to this if I really wanted to. And what I would do is square the front off. So I'd take this thing off, there are little eyes molded in here. I'd probably take this thing off with a knife right about there, just so it marries up nicely with the back of this jig head and tucks in right there essentially. So just kind of measure things up, figure out where it's going to fit nicely, and cut it off. So what you'll notice about these two jig heads, this jig head compared to the other bullet head, is look at the length of the shank of the hook. So this is a nice long bait. This is actually a fairly short hook shank on this jig head compared to some of the others. So let's compare it to like this underspin. And this underspin's got a little bit longer hook shank on it, not too much. It's deceptive, but keep that in mind, like we were talking about earlier, making sure the size of your hook matches the size of your bait. You don't want it to be too short. So if it's too short, we end up with our hook up here, so we use like a little tiny ball head or something like that, like a crappy jig. The problem we run into is you might get a bass short strike this thing and it hits it back here in the tail and never gets a hold of the hook. So we want the hook as far back in the bait as we can get it. And like I said, if you've got a hook slit in the top, it's a fairly good indication of about how far you could reasonably want to go back before it starts affecting the action.
All right, so that wraps up the 3-part series on rigging swim baits and the various types of soft plastic swim baits. If you liked the video, give me a thumbs up. If you got any further questions, go ahead and ask them in the comments section. If you like this style of video and you want me to do more like this, leave comments below on other kinds of videos, rigging videos, and tricks and tips and stuff like that you'd like to see. Subscribe to my channel and check out my other videos. Until next time, cheers and tight lines.